Think about this. It is Boxing Day, 1900. You are standing on the deck of a ship called the Hesperus, waves crashing against its hull. Through the morning mist, a lighthouse emerges from the darkness. A tower that should be blazing with light, guiding ships to safety. But it is dark, and you are about to discover why. Joseph Moore clutches the railing, his knuckles white. He is a lighthouse keeper being sent to relieve 3 men stationed on one of the most isolated spots on Earth, the Flannan Isles. 20 miles from civilization, 7 rocky islands jutting from the North Atlantic like the teeth of some sleeping giant. The ship's horn blasts 3 times. Silence. They fire a signal rocket into the gray sky. Still, nothing. Joseph Moore feels his stomach drop. He has known for 6 days that something was wrong. The lighthouse went dark on December 15th, but weather kept them from investigating until now, 11 days later. As the small boat rows him toward the east landing, one thought pounds in his head. Where are they? Because what Joseph Moore is about to find will haunt him for the rest of his life. And 125 years later, we still don't have answers. This is the story of 3 men who vanished without a trace. No bodies, no witnesses, no explanation. Welcome to the Flannan Isles Mystery, the disappearance that time forgot. Let me take you back to where this all began. The Flannan Isles, or as the locals called them, the 7 Hunters, sit in one of the most hostile stretches of ocean on the planet. 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, these 7 jagged rocks rise from waters that have claimed countless ships. For centuries, nobody lived there. Nobody wanted to. The islands were named after Saint Flannan, a 7th century Irish priest, but the locals viewed them with deep superstition. Fishermen would ferry sheep to graze on the island's surprisingly lush grass, but they refused to stay overnight. They whispered stories of phantom ships, of strange lights, of voices carried on the wind. The islands were cursed, they said, haunted. But by the 1890s, as maritime traffic increased, the British government needed a lighthouse there. Too many ships were running aground in the darkness. Too many lives were being lost. So, in 1895, construction began. Imagine trying to build a 75-foot lighthouse on an island where landing supplies is nearly impossible, where Atlantic storms can whip up waves that tower 40 feet high, where winds can literally lift a grown man off his feet. It took 4 years. Workers had to haul every stone, every piece of equipment up 150-foot cliffs. They built a cable railway system just to move supplies. They constructed living quarters that could withstand the fury of the ocean. They installed landing platforms on both sides of the island, east and west, because sometimes the sea would be too rough on one side to land at all. On December 7th, 1899, the lighthouse was finally lit for the first time. The cost? Nearly £5,500. That is equivalent to almost $800,000 today. It was a triumph of Victorian engineering, state-of-the-art, built to last. But here is what is chilling. Exactly 1 year later, to the day, 3 men would walk into this lighthouse and never walk out. The lighthouse required 4 keepers in total. 3 would be stationed on the island at any given time, working in rotation. The 4th would remain on shore at the station in Brestclete on the Isle of Lewis, enjoying leave before returning for his next shift. It was a lonely existence, weeks away from family, nothing but rock, sea, and sky. The closest thing to human contact was a relief ship that came every 2 weeks with supplies. But these men were professionals. They were chosen for their experience, their steady temperament, their ability to handle isolation and pressure. They kept meticulous logs, they followed strict procedures, they never left the lighthouse unattended. So when 3 of the best lighthouse keepers in Scotland disappeared simultaneously, it didn't just raise questions, it shattered everything people thought they knew about what was possible. Let us meet the 3 men who were about to become a mystery. James Ducat was 43 years old, the principal keeper, the man in charge. He had been working lighthouses for over 20 years. People called him one of the finest lighthouse keepers in the entire Northern Lighthouse Board. Experienced, reliable, unflappable. He had a wife and 4 children back home: Louisa, 16, Robert, 13, Annabella, 9, and little Arthur, just 6 years old. He had promised them he would be home for Christmas. That promise would haunt his family forever. Thomas Marshall was 28, the second assistant keeper. Unmarried, but close to his father, brother, and sister. He had already served at multiple lighthouse stations, earning commendations for his work. Here is something important. Marshall had been fined 5 shillings at a previous posting for losing equipment in a storm. 5 shillings might not sound like much, but for a man of his position, it was a significant financial penalty. That fine would matter. We will come back to it. Donald McArthur was 40, the occasional keeper, essentially the substitute who filled in when regular keepers were on leave. Now, McArthur wasn't supposed to be there that long. He was covering for a first assistant keeper named William Ross, who was on extended sick leave. McArthur had expected to be there for a few weeks, but he had already spent most of October, all of November, and the first part of December on the island. That is over 2 months of isolation, 2 months away from his wife and 2 children, 2 months of the same 3 rooms, the same faces, the same endless ocean. Some later theories would suggest this extended stay had taken a psychological toll, that cabin fever had set in, that tensions were building. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. On December 7, 1900, Superintendent Robert Moorhead made an unusual visit to the Flannan Isles. It was rare for someone of his position to travel to such a remote station in the middle of winter. The official records don't say why he came, but the timing suggests something was wrong. Maybe complaints had been made. Maybe tensions between the keepers had been reported. Whatever the reason, Moorhead spent time with the men. He inspected the lighthouse. He assured McArthur that relief keeper Joseph Moore would arrive on December 20th, just 13 more days. When Moorhead left that evening, he stood on the east landing and waved goodbye to James Ducat and Thomas Marshall. He could see Donald McArthur up at the lighthouse, manning the light as regulations required. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. Moorhead later wrote something that still sends chills down your spine. Quote, "I have the melancholy recollection that I was the last person to shake hands with them and bid them adieu." He didn't know it then, but he had just sealed his place in one of maritime history's greatest mysteries. December 15th, 1900. Just past midnight, the SS Arctur, a transatlantic steamer making its way from Philadelphia to Edinburgh passes by the Flannan Isles. The captain looks toward where the lighthouse should be. Darkness. Complete and total darkness. For a lighthouse keeper, letting your light go out is the worst possible failure. It is like a fireman starting fires or a doctor spreading disease. Lighthouse keepers lived by one sacred rule: the light never goes dark. The Arcturus captain noted it in his log. Something was very wrong. But the ship kept going, eventually running aground in the Firth of Forth. By the time they managed to get word to the authorities, days had passed. Meanwhile, on the Isle of Lewis, a gamekeeper named Roderick Mackenzie had been keeping his own log. His job was to watch for the lighthouse signal from shore and report any problems. Between December 7th and Christmas Day, he only saw the light twice. Twice in 18 days. But here is the heartbreaking part. The relief ship wasn't scheduled to arrive until December 20th, and when that date came, savage Atlantic storms kept the Hesperus trapped in port for 6 more days. 6 days of the lighthouse sitting dark. 6 days of 3 men potentially needing help. 6 days that might have made all the difference. Joseph Moore paced the deck during those 6 days. He barely slept, barely ate. Other crew members tried to engage him in conversation, but he just grunted or nodded, lost in thought. He had a feeling, one of those gut feelings you can't shake, that something terrible had happened. On Boxing Day, December 26th, the weather finally broke enough for the Hesperus to sail. As they approached the island, Captain James Harvey noticed immediately: no flag flying, no provision boxes set out on the landing, no keepers waving in greeting. 3 horn blasts split the air. Nothing. They fired a rocket. Silence. Harvey turned to Moore and a crewman named McCormick. He said, "Take the launch. Find out what happened." Moore climbed out of the small boat at the east landing. McCormick stayed behind as instructed. The lighthouse keeper began the long climb up the 160 steep steps carved into the cliff face. With every step, his dread grew heavier. The entrance gate closed, the main door too. Moore pushed it open. "Hello? Ducat? Marshall? McArthur?" His voice echoed through empty rooms. He moved through the lighthouse, his eyes taking in every detail. The lamps were cleaned and refilled, ready for the night's work. The beds were unmade, as if the men had just gotten up that morning. The kitchen was tidy, dishes washed and put away. Cold ashes sat in the fireplace. And then Moore noticed something odd. A chair was overturned in the kitchen. More disturbing, all the clocks had stopped. Moore rushed back to the Hesperus and reported to Captain Harvey. They sent more men up, volunteers who understood the gravity of what they were facing. A wider search began. The east landing was intact, everything in order. But the west landing told a different story. Picture this: a wooden storage box positioned 110 feet above sea level, 33 meters up, had been completely destroyed. Its contents were scattered across the rocks. Ropes and crane handles lay tangled around the crane's legs. Iron railings, thick and sturdy, were bent over like pipe cleaners. A railway track built into the cliff path had been torn completely out of its concrete housing. And here is what still gives researchers chills. A boulder weighing over a ton had been displaced from its position more than 200 feet above the ocean. Let me repeat that. A 1-ton rock, 200 feet above sea level, moved by the force of a wave or wind. On top of the cliff, turf had been ripped away as far as 30 feet from the edge. The power required to cause this kind of damage is almost incomprehensible. Inside the lighthouse, the log told its own story. The last official entry was December 13th, but on a slate board where keepers would jot notes before transferring them to the official log were entries from the morning of December 15th. Weather readings, barometer, thermometer, wind conditions, time the light was extinguished. All recorded at 9 a.m. on December 15th. Everything suggested the men had completed their morning routine. Everything was in order. The lamp was ready to be lit that evening, but they never lit it. Sometime that afternoon, before nightfall, all 3 men had vanished. Then came the most puzzling clue of all. 2 sets of oilskins, the heavy weather gear lighthouse keepers wore in storms, were missing. 1 set remained hanging by the door. Think about what that means. 2 men had gone outside prepared for harsh weather, but 1 man, 1 experienced lighthouse keeper, had gone out without protection. In December, in the North Atlantic, during storm season. Why? Before we talk about what probably happened, we need to address what definitely didn't happen, but what everyone thinks did. You have probably heard about the mysterious log entries, the ones where Marshall supposedly wrote that a storm like none he had seen in 20 years was raging, where he reported that Ducat had gone quiet, that McArthur, a tough, burly sea dog, was crying, that all 3 men were praying, and that final entry on the 15th, storm ended, sea calm, God is over all. Here is the truth. Those log entries never existed. They were completely fabricated, appearing first in a 1921 American pulp magazine, 21 years after the event. Journalist Mike Dash from Fortean Times traced this fiction back to its source. The real logs showed nothing unusual. No emotional commentary, no religious references, just standard weather observations and routine maintenance notes. Think about it logically. Lighthouse logs are official documents, process-bound, professional. It would be the equivalent of you writing, "My boss is in a terrible mood today," in an official company report. Your superior would demand an explanation. Marshall writing that his commanding officer Ducat was quiet or that McArthur was crying would have been grounds for discipline. The half-eaten meal never happened. No contemporary account mentions it. That is another fabrication that somehow became fact. The overturned chair, even that is questionable. It appears in Moore's initial report, but nowhere else. So why did these fake details spread? Because humans crave narrative. We want mystery. We want the supernatural. A simple tragedy isn't enough. We want Gothic horror. Over the years, theories multiplied like legends. Sea serpents dragging the men into the deep, giant birds carrying them away, phantom ships crewed by ghosts, foreign spies kidnapping them, even alien abduction got thrown into the mix. The Flannan Isles already had a reputation for being haunted. Local shepherds refused to spend the night there. Fishermen told stories of strange lights and phantom voices. So when 3 men vanished, the supernatural explanations practically wrote themselves. But here's what we know for certain. No evidence of struggle inside the lighthouse. Extensive storm damage at the west landing. 2 sets of oilskins missing, 1 remaining. Morning routine completed on December 15th. No log entries after that. 3 experienced professional lighthouse keepers gone. So what actually happened? Let us walk through the most likely scenario. Remember Thomas Marshall, the keeper who had been fined 5 shillings for losing equipment in a previous storm? That wasn't just a financial penalty. It was a mark on his professional record, a reminder that carelessness has consequences. Now look at the damage at the West Landing. A storage box containing essential mooring ropes and crane equipment had been destroyed. Some contents were scattered, others were missing. That equipment was critical. Losing it would mean another fine, another black mark. Marshall and Ducat likely went out on the afternoon of December 15th to secure or retrieve that equipment. The weather was deteriorating. 30 to 40-foot waves were hammering the west side of the island. They put on their oilskins. They made their way carefully down to the West Landing. And then, something went wrong. Maybe one of them lost his footing on the wet rocks. Maybe a wave swept one of them off balance. When that happened, the other would have instinctively tried to help. Meanwhile, up at the lighthouse, Donald McArthur was manning the light as regulations required. One man always had to stay with the lamp. But when his colleagues didn't return, McArthur faced a terrible choice. He could stay at his post, following the rules, or he could go help his friends. He chose his friends. He rushed out without taking time to put on his oilskins. He was only going for a moment, just to check, just to see if they needed help. He turned the corner toward the west side, toward the area with the low protective wall that offered no shelter from the wind, and a rogue wave, one of those freak walls of water the Atlantic is infamous for, swept all 3 men into the sea. Superintendent Robert Moorhead investigated thoroughly. His conclusion? Quote, "From the evidence I was able to procure, I was satisfied that the men had been on duty up till dinner time on Saturday the 15th of December, that they had gone down to secure a box in a crevice in the cliff, and that an extra large sea had rushed up the face of the rock and swept them away." Some experts disagree. They point out that experienced keepers like Ducat wouldn't go out so late in the day, with darkness approaching and weather worsening. Others suggest a different theory, the wind tunnel effect. The lighthouse sits on sloped ground. The wall around the complex is lower on the west side, creating a funnel for westerly winds. Keepers who served there in later years reported being lifted off their feet by sudden gusts. Maybe shutters were banging, maybe doors were slamming. 2 men went to investigate, and a violent gust simply carried them over the low wall and down the 200-foot cliff. The 3rd man went to look for them and suffered the same fate. There is one darker theory, that cabin fever drove Donald McArthur to violence, that he killed the other 2 men, then threw himself from the cliffs rather than face justice. But there is no evidence of struggle, no blood, no signs of violence in the lighthouse. And McArthur, despite being described as occasionally surly, had no history of violence. He was a professional, a family man. The simplest explanation remains the most likely. The sea took them. No bodies were ever recovered. The Atlantic doesn't give up her dead easily. The lighthouse continued operating for another 71 years. It was staffed by keepers who slept in the same beds, walked the same paths, and knew the same story. Nothing supernatural ever happened. No ghosts, no mysterious disappearances. In 1971, the lighthouse became fully automated. Today, it is maintained remotely. The Flannan Isles sit empty once again, visited only occasionally by maintenance crews. But the mystery endures. 3 men walked out of a lighthouse on December 15, 1900, and vanished into the winter air. They left behind families who never got closure. James Ducat's wife and 4 children, McArthur's wife and 2 children, Marshall's father, brother, and sister. They left behind questions that 125 years haven't answered. and they left behind a lighthouse that still stands today, its light sweeping across the same treacherous waters that claimed them. Sometimes the truth isn't mysterious or supernatural. Sometimes it is just tragic. 3 men doing their job, 3 men trying to save valuable equipment, 3 men caught by the raw, indifferent power of the ocean. The sea doesn't care about experience or precautions or loved ones waiting at home. The sea takes what it wants. And on December 15, 1900, it wanted 3 lighthouse keepers. In his official report, Superintendent Robert Moorhead wrote, "I visited them as lately as the 7th of December and have the melancholy recollection that I was the last person to shake hands with them and bid them adieu. The last person to see them, the last person to speak with them, the last witness to 3 men who would become a legend. Rest in peace, James Ducat. Rest in peace, Thomas Marshall. Rest in peace, Donald McArthur. Your mystery may never be solved, but your memory lives on."